Have you ever been in an interview where you got asked a question that you weren't prepared for and just had no idea how to answer? Perhaps it rattled you so much that it threw off the rest of the interview. Well, I think most of us that have done more than one interview have probably experienced something like this. And the reality is, if you're interviewing for a job, then you probably really want the job, or at the very least, would like to do well in the interview and not feel foolish. So in order to do so, you need to be better prepared for the interview. In today's video, I'm going to share the basics of behavioral-based interviewing so you can feel more confident and do better in most interviewing situations. This will be the first video in a series of videos that I'm calling The Art of the Interview, so be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can be notified when I post the next videos in this series. I work in a corporate setting and have been interviewing for over 10 years. During that time, I've interviewed literally hundreds of candidates and can give you firsthand feedback on what most interviewers are looking for in an interview situation. The method I'm going to describe is behavioral interviewing, but really, the way you answer a question for a behavioral interview can be used in almost any type of interviewing situation, except for maybe something like a technical interview. And if you're not familiar with behavioral interviewing, it's actually the most prominent interviewing technique used to fill corporate or professional jobs. Let's start off with the definition of what behavioral interviewing is. It's an interviewing technique that asks questions that's looking for specific examples from your past that demonstrate a certain behavior, skill, or characteristic that's important to the job. The idea being that past performance is a better indicator for how you will perform in similar situations in the future. You know you're in a behavioral interview when you get a question like, "Tell me about a time when," or "Describe a situation in which you," and then they describe something. Now, I realize that that's not technically always a question, but that's semantics. That's how you know you're in a behavioral-based interview. For your example, your interviewer wants you to provide one particular example from your past that matches whatever scenario they're looking for. To frame your answer, just remember the STAR acronym, which sets up what information should be included in your answer. So, STAR, for the S, that is what is the scenario that applies to the situation or the question that was asked. T is what were the tasks that were required of you. A stands for the actions that you took in order to complete the tasks, and R is what was the result of those actions. So let me give you an example. For the question, "Tell me about a time when you had to manage customer expectations and how did you handle it?" I might provide an answer similar to the following. In a previous role, I was a supervisor in charge of a service delivery group responsible for delivering a service to internal customers across a large part of our company. And our company at that time had a philosophy where our service delivery groups were supply constrained, basically meaning that we expected there to be more demand for our services than we had the bandwidth in order to do. And that meant that I was going to have customers that were making requests of me that I would not be able to fill. I didn't really feel like I was always the best person to prioritize against all the various requests that I was receiving and determine whose work should be getting done and whose work shouldn't, and then communicate that out. Therefore, what I decided to do was to set up a prioritization meeting that included each of the decision makers from the various internal customer groups in my company that were requesting my services. We held these meetings monthly, and in the very first meeting, we all got together and decided on a prioritization framework that we all could agree to for how we were going to prioritize the requests. Then in the subsequent meetings, I would basically facilitate as the rest of my decision makers from my internal customer groups described the requests that they had, and then everyone worked together on what the prioritization would be, what would likely be done that next month, and what would likely not be done. The result of that was for the decision makers of those different groups to feel like they had ownership in deciding what work was going to be done, and also getting to hear firsthand why their work might not be getting done. It was a very effective prioritization method and something that I continued for my rest of the time in that role. And it was so successful that the other groups that had a similar supply-constrained philosophy also adopted this methodology and used it for the services that they were providing. So there's my answer, but you can see how that's a much better answer than something that might be a little bit more opinion-based, like, well, when I have to manage customer expectations, I like for them to help me make the decision. First of all, an answer like that isn't very specific, but second of all, it's not really speaking to a specific example of when I would have done that. So as the interviewee, I might be answering what I think you want to hear rather than something that I've actually done and proves that that's how I would do it in a similar situation in the future. And remember that for each behavioral interview question that you get, there is a certain behavior, skill, trait, characteristic that the interviewer is listening for in your example. So when you hear that question and you're trying to figure out what example you're going to use, make sure that you're thinking about what that behavior is and that you're keeping that in mind in how you frame up your answer. In my example, tell me about a time when you had to manage customer expectations. The behavior is going to be something around customer service or having a customer focus or mindset. Now, sometimes after you provide your answer, your interviewer will ask some follow-up questions, either to clarify information that you provided or make sure they understand it, or sometimes to help fill in pieces of the star that you might have missed. In my experience, the piece of the star that gets missed the most often is the result. So don't worry if you do miss a piece and your interviewer has to ask you additional questions, because they're just trying to make sure that they get the information that they need in order to make a good decision of how you would do in that role. Now, not every interview situation that you're going to be in is going to be a behavioral interview, but I do find that using the STAR technique to provide answers is something that you can use even beyond specific behavioral questions. For instance, if you do get asked a question that's more opinion-based, you can still turn the answer around to an example to help explain why you have the opinion you do. For example, if I got asked a question such as, "What do you think one of your strongest strengths is?" I could answer it like the following. I think I'm a very strong communicator. For instance, in my current role, I have to communicate with management on a frequent basis. In a recent example, I had to communicate a technical operational issue that we were having to them so they could come at a decision on what we should do. So I prepared a presentation where I took that technical information and turned it into more layman's terms that my non-technical leadership audience could understand. I then made a recommendation, and at the end of that presentation, they all agreed with the recommendation that I made. So not only did I get the decision that I was looking for because of my strong communication skills, but I also got recognition from my supervisor who was in that meeting on what a great job I'd done. So not only did I share what my strength was to my interviewer, but I gave them an example to help them know that I'm not just telling them what I think they want to hear, but also provided some details on why, and more specifically how, I'm a good communicator. And one of the great things about behavioral interviewing is there really are no right or wrong answers. There can just be better answers to help the interviewer be able to gauge how you would do in the role that they're interviewing you for. Now you've learned the basics of behavioral interviewing. Be sure to stay tuned for my next video in this series, which is going to be all about how to prepare for an interview. If you haven't already subscribed, you can click the link below or even in the video screen to do so. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you found it useful or liked it. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.